They threw her out of the family the day her husband died. Not the next week. Not after the funeral. Not after the lawyers had time to gather and the paperwork had time to settle. The same day. Within 8 hours of the hospital calling, while the grief was still raw and the house still smelled like the man who had just left it, Carter Hargrove stood at the front door of the estate his father had built and told the woman who had lived in it for 31 years that her presence was no longer appropriate. He used those exact words. No longer appropriate. As if she were a piece of furniture that had been acceptable in a previous arrangement but did not fit the new one. As if 31 years of a life built inside those walls could be neatly folded and removed the same afternoon the man who had shared it with her stopped breathing. The last thing Eleanor Hargrove packed before she left was a photograph. Not jewelry. Not documents. Not the 31 years of accumulated evidence that this house had been her home as much as anyone else's. Just a single framed photograph from a mantel in a room she had walked past 10,000 times, a photograph of her and her husband standing in the garden on a Tuesday afternoon in September with no particular occasion attached to it, just two people who had found each other late enough in life to know exactly what they had found. She tucked it under her arm, walked through the front door of that house, and did not look back. She did not look back because she had learned, over 31 years of living alongside people who were waiting for her to show weakness, that looking back is the one thing you cannot afford to do when the people watching you are hoping you will fall apart. Carter closed the door behind her. He did not slam it. Slamming would have suggested emotion, and Carter had spent a lifetime performing the particular kind of coldness that is more devastating than anger because it carries within it the implication that you are not even worth the energy of a raised voice. He simply closed it. The lock clicked. And Eleanor Hargrove stood on the stone step of the house where she had lived since 1993 in the November air with a photograph under her arm and the full weight of what had just happened pressing down on her from every direction. Her husband of 31 years had died 4 hours ago. And his children from his first marriage had already changed the terms. There are moments in life that feel like endings. Moments so brutal, so deliberate, so carefully designed to destroy a person that everyone watching assumes the story is over. The door closes. The car pulls away. The family moves on. And the woman standing alone in the cold outside a house she helped build for 31 years has nowhere left to go and nothing left to hold on to except whatever is left of her dignity. Most people in that position break. Most people in that position accept what they have been told, which is that they are nothing, that they were never anything, and that the people inside that warm house with its lights and its lawyers and its certainty have already decided how this story ends. But every once in a while, the phone rings. And everything that seems certain becomes the most fragile thing in the world. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now stay with me. Because what happened 3 days after that door closed is one of the most extraordinary reversals in American private wealth history. And to understand it fully, you need to understand who William Hargrove really was. Not the version Carter and Diane and Renee had spent years constructing. The real William Hargrove. The man behind the name on the buildings. William Hargrove was born in 1946 in Youngstown, Ohio, to a father who worked in a steel mill and a mother who balanced the family checkbook to the penny every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. There was no inheritance. There was no family money waiting at the end of a long education. There was a work ethic so deeply embedded in the structure of his upbringing that William Hargrove could not have separated it from himself any more than he could have separated his own name from his face. He made his first real estate investment at 24 using money he had saved working construction during summers while completing his business degree at night school. The property was a failing commercial strip in Akron that everyone who looked at it told him was a mistake. He bought it anyway. Turned it around in 18 months. Sold it for 3 times what he paid. Bought 2 more properties with the proceeds. Then 4. Then 12. By the time he was 40, Hargrove Capital was a name that people in commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard knew immediately. By 50 it was a name that the entire country knew. By 65, William Hargrove's estate had been independently valued at just over $60 billion, and he had a reputation as one of the most disciplined and least readable men in American private real estate. Nobody ever quite knew what William was thinking. Nobody ever quite knew what he was planning. That quality, which had made him so effective in business, was also the quality that made what he did in the last 3 years of his life so remarkable. Because the people who believed they knew him best turned out not to know him at all. William had been married once before Eleanor. Her name was Sandra, and they had married young, in 1971, when William was 25 and still working construction summers and building his first portfolio nights and weekends. Sandra gave him 3 children over the course of their 9-year marriage, a son named Carter and 2 daughters named Diane and Renee. The marriage ended in 1980. Sandra always said it ended because William chose the business over the family, and she was not entirely wrong, but the truth was more complicated in the way the truth of any long marriage is always more complicated than the story either person tells about it afterward. Sandra received a settlement that was generous by the standards of that era and considerably less than what William's business was actually worth by the time the papers were signed, a fact that Sandra knew and that formed the invisible bedrock of everything Carter, Diane, and Renee believed about their father and about money and about who deserved what when William Hargrove finally died. Carter, Diane, and Renee grew up in their mother's house with William as a weekend presence that gradually became a monthly presence and then a quarterly one as the business consumed more of the available time and attention. He paid for everything. Private schools, college, graduate school for Diane, a startup investment for Carter that William personally guaranteed with his own signature. He was not absent in the financial sense. He was absent in the sense that mattered more to 3 children growing up, the daily ordinary sense of dinners and arguments and homework and the small unremarkable moments that accumulate into what we actually mean when we say we know someone. Eleanor came into William's life in 1992. She was 35 years old and she had been hired to redesign the grounds of a Hargrove Capital property in Greenwich, Connecticut. She was a landscape architect from Vermont who had grown up in a family that placed more value on land and craft and the kind of knowledge that comes from working with your hands than on money, and she had spent enough years working on properties owned by wealthy people to understand that wealth and character are not the same thing and are sometimes in direct opposition to each other. She met William on a Tuesday morning when he arrived unannounced at the property while she was in the middle of a conversation with her crew about soil drainage grades. He introduced himself. She nodded, told him she would be with him in a few minutes, and went back to the conversation she was having. William Hargrove later told a close friend that this was the precise moment he understood she was different from almost everyone else he had met in 20 years of being someone whose time was considered valuable by default. She finished her conversation. Then she turned to him and answered his questions about the project with the kind of direct, detailed competence that William recognized immediately because it was the quality he most valued in any person he encountered. He visited the property 6 more times during the renovation. He invited her to dinner. She declined twice. Then she said yes. They were married in 1993 in a small ceremony. Carter, Diane, and Renee did not attend. The hostility from William's first family was immediate and it never softened in 31 years, not once, not by a single degree. Carter made his position clear early and maintained it with a consistency that was almost admirable in its stubbornness. He was never openly rude to Eleanor in settings where it would have reflected badly on him. He was simply and persistently cold in the way of someone who has decided that a person does not merit the energy of genuine engagement. He referred to her in conversations with his sisters as the landscaper, always with the particular inflection that makes a profession sound like an insult. Diane performed a version of civility that was careful enough to give her plausible deniability but hollow enough that Eleanor could feel the absence of anything real behind it every time they occupied the same room. Renee was the most openly hostile and also the most inconsistent, swinging between periods of something almost like warmth and episodes of deliberate cruelty delivered with a smile that was clearly intended to make the cruelty harder to name and therefore harder to respond to. Eleanor endured all of it without visible complaint. Not because she was without her own feelings about it. She had feelings about it that she kept very carefully to herself. But because she understood something that 31 years of observation had made completely clear to her, which was that their hostility was not really about her. It was about a fear that had been living in them since childhood, a fear that the man whose fortune they were waiting for might not leave it where they had always assumed it would go. What none of them ever understood was the actual nature of Eleanor's marriage to William. They had constructed a version of it that made sense within their framework, a version in which Eleanor was a strategically positioned woman who had managed William's domestic life and his loneliness in exchange for proximity to his wealth. This version was not only wrong but was wrong in almost every specific detail. Eleanor had not managed William's loneliness. She had been his intellectual equal and his most trusted advisor and the person he called first when something significant happened and the person whose judgment he sought on matters that went far beyond anything related to landscape architecture or domestic management. She had sat beside him in board meetings and her observations had been taken seriously enough by William that he had incorporated them into decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had read acquisition proposals at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings and her analysis had shaped transactions that his professional team later described as among the most well-judged of William's career. She had been, in every meaningful sense of the word, his partner. And William Hargrove, who trusted almost nobody and had built $60 billion on that distrust, trusted Eleanor with everything that mattered to him. 3 years before he died, William received a medical diagnosis that he did not share with Carter, Diane, Renee, or anyone in his professional circle. He shared it with 2 people. Eleanor, and a man named James Whitfield, a senior partner at a private estate planning firm in New York City that had no previous relationship with the Hargrove family and no connection to Douglas Fenn, the family attorney of record who had handled Hargrove Capital's legal matters for 2 decades. William had found Whitfield through a referral from someone he trusted completely, a referral made quietly and without any documentation connecting it to William's known professional relationships. He met with Whitfield alone on a Friday afternoon in October in an office on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. He told Whitfield exactly what he intended to do and exactly why. He told Whitfield that he had approximately 3 years and that he intended to use every day of them to build something that would withstand whatever came after it. Whitfield later said that in 28 years of estate law he had never begun a client relationship quite like that one. Not because of the size of the estate, which was extraordinary, but because of the absolute clarity and the complete calm of the man sitting across from him describing what he intended to build. William spent those 3 years working with Whitfield and Associates in complete secrecy. On the surface he continued to be exactly what he had always been. He chaired board meetings. He made acquisitions. He attended the dinners and industry events expected of a man in his position. He continued to take Carter's calls about the business and to meet with Douglas Fenn on matters unrelated to the estate and to be, to every person who observed him from the outside, the same private, disciplined, slightly unreadable man who had run a $60 billion empire with the same focus he had brought to his first commercial strip in Akron 4 decades earlier. And simultaneously, in a layer of his life that was completely invisible to everyone except Eleanor and James Whitfield, he was building the most comprehensive and deliberately constructed estate document that Whitfield and Associates had ever handled. He had the document stress-tested by a separate firm retained specifically to find its weaknesses. He addressed every weakness that firm identified. He anticipated every legal argument that could be brought against the document and built the specific counter to that argument directly into its structure. He was thinking, with the same obsessive thoroughness that had built everything he had ever made, about exactly what Carter would do when he found out. And he was making sure, point by point and provision by provision, that what Carter would do would not work. Eleanor knew the broad outlines of what William was doing. She knew about the diagnosis. She knew about Whitfield. She knew that the estate was being restructured and that the restructuring was designed with her in mind. What she did not know, because William had chosen not to tell her, was the specific scope of what he had built. He told her once, sitting in the sunroom of the Greenwich house on a January afternoon in the last winter of his life with snow on the ground outside and the particular quality of light that comes through bare trees in winter, that he had taken care of things. She said she knew. He said, I mean I have really taken care of things. She looked at him for a moment across the space between their chairs. She said she understood. He said, you will understand more later. She told him she did not need to understand more later. She needed him to be here. He said he was working on that too. It was the closest thing to a joke he made in the last year of his life. She told that story later to James Whitfield, and Whitfield wrote it down in a personal notebook he kept separate from his professional files because he said it was the kind of detail that deserved to exist somewhere that was not a legal document. William Hargrove died on a Tuesday morning in November. He had been in the hospital for 11 days and Eleanor had been there for all of them, sleeping in the chair beside his bed on the nights when the nurses offered her a cot and she declined because she did not want to be further from him than the chair allowed. Carter arrived at the hospital on the third day and spent 40 minutes in the room and then left to take a call in the corridor. Diane arrived on the fifth day and spent most of her visit in the waiting room. Renee arrived on the seventh day and cried in a way that Eleanor observed carefully and could not find anything performed in, which softened something in her toward Renee that 31 years of accumulated history had made very hard. William died with Eleanor holding his hand. Carter was in the parking garage. The nurse found him there and told him, and he came upstairs and stood in the doorway of the room and looked at his father and then looked at Eleanor and then looked back at his father and said nothing. 4 hours later Carter called Douglas Fenn. 6 hours after William died, Carter, Diane, and Renee had gathered at the Hargrove estate in Greenwich. 8 hours after William died, Eleanor was standing on the stone front step with the photograph under her arm and Carter's voice still in the air around her, delivering its particular brand of precise cold instruction. He had told her the estate was a Hargrove family asset. He had told her her presence was no longer appropriate. He had told her that Douglas Fenn would be in touch regarding her arrangements. She did not argue. She did not ask him to reconsider. She did not tell him what she knew, which was something that would have changed the entire temperature of that conversation if she had chosen to use it. She walked to her car. She drove to the small rented house in Westport where a friend had told her she could stay as long as she needed. She sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of her. And she did not sleep. The first day she made coffee and looked out at a garden she had not planted and thought about William and about the particular cruelty of losing someone gradually, the way an approaching end reorganizes every conversation and makes the ordinary ones feel insufficient in retrospect. The second day she answered messages from people offering condolences and tried to eat at regular intervals because William had always told her that grief required maintenance the same way any serious project did, and she was trying to honor that even now. The third day, a Thursday morning in November, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee when her phone rang. A New York City area code she did not recognize. She looked at it for 2 full rings. She almost did not answer. Then she did. The voice on the other end identified itself as James Whitfield, senior partner at Whitfield & Associates in Manhattan. He told her he had been retained by her late husband William Hargrove and that he needed to meet with her at her earliest possible convenience regarding the terms of Mr. Hargrove's estate. She asked what she should expect from that meeting. There was a pause of exactly 3 seconds. Then Whitfield said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I think you should know that your husband was a very thorough man." She said she knew. He said, "I don't think you fully understand yet exactly how thorough." She asked him what time she should arrive. He said 9 in the morning. She said she would be there. She put the phone down on the kitchen table. She looked at the photograph of herself and William in the garden on that Tuesday afternoon in September with no particular occasion attached to it. She picked up her coffee. She finished it. She went upstairs and packed a bag. Eleanor drove to Manhattan on a Friday morning in November with the heat on low and the radio off and the gray Connecticut landscape moving past her windows in a way that felt slightly unreal, the way everything felt slightly unreal in those first days after William died, as if the world had not yet fully registered his absence and was still operating on rules that had organized it while he was in it. She had not told Carter she was going. She had not told Diane or Renee. She had not called Douglas Fenn. She had put James Whitfield's number in her phone, backed her car out of the driveway of the rented house in Westport, and driven south on a gray November Friday toward a conversation that her husband had spent 3 years preparing for and that she was about to have for the first time. The offices of Whitfield and Associates were on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan with views that on a clear day extended to the horizon. It was not a clear day. The city was the color of brushed steel under a low November sky, and Central Park was bare, and the traffic on the streets below moved with the compressed energy of a Friday morning in a city that is already thinking about the weekend. Eleanor arrived at 9 exactly. James Whitfield met her at the elevator himself. She noted this. In her experience, senior partners of firms like this one did not meet clients at the elevator unless the client was someone who required a particular quality of care. He was a man in his early 60s, precise and careful in the way of someone who has spent a career understanding that the words he chooses will have consequences long after the conversations that generated them. He shook her hand. He offered coffee. He led her to a conference room where a single manila folder sat in the center of a long table. He sat across from her. He opened the folder. And he began to explain what William Hargrove had spent 3 years building in complete secrecy. The estate, as Whitfield laid it out over the following 2 hours, was structured with the same obsessive thoroughness that had characterized everything William had built in 50 years of professional life. The total value of the assets named in the primary estate document, real estate holdings across 14 states, equity positions in 37 companies, private investment funds, liquid assets, a significant art collection, and several categories of holdings that even Eleanor had not been fully aware of during their marriage, had been independently appraised at $62 billion. Of that total, Eleanor was named as primary beneficiary of assets valued at approximately $58 billion. The remaining $4 billion was allocated in specific named distributions to charitable foundations William had established and to a small number of individuals and institutions he had selected personally over the preceding 3 years. Carter Hargrove was not named anywhere in the document. Diane Hargrove was not named anywhere in the document. Renee Hargrove was not named anywhere in the document. In $62 billion of meticulously organized assets, William Hargrove had not left a single dollar to the 3 children from his first marriage. Not $1. Not one asset. Not one line of acknowledgement in 62 pages of extraordinarily detailed legal language. Eleanor sat in that conference room and listened to James Whitfield explain all of this with the stillness of someone absorbing something very large and choosing to absorb it completely before responding to any part of it. She had known that William was restructuring the estate. She had known about Whitfield in the general sense. She had known, as William had told her in the sunroom on that January afternoon, that he had taken care of things. What she had not known was the specific and complete scope of what taking care of things had meant to a man like William Hargrove. The number itself, $62 billion, was not a surprise in the way that a number can be a surprise when you have lived alongside the business that generated it for 31 years and paid close enough attention to understand its scale. What was a surprise was the completeness of it. The absolute nature of the decision William had made. He had not hedged. He had not softened the edges of what he was doing by leaving Carter and Diane and Renee some portion that would have blunted their motivation to challenge the document while still honoring a version of paternal obligation. He had looked at 30 years of who his children from his first marriage had shown him they were, and he had made a decision that was so complete and so final that it left no room anywhere within it for a different interpretation. She asked Whitfield one question when he finished. She asked whether the document was airtight. Whitfield looked at her with the measured expression of a man who selects his words from a carefully maintained vocabulary and said that in 28 years of estate law he had never seen a document more thoroughly constructed or more deliberately anticipatory of challenge. He told her that William had spent a full year of the 3-year planning process specifically engineering the document to anticipate and defeat every legal argument that could reasonably be brought against it. He told her that William had retained a separate firm at his own expense specifically to attempt to find weaknesses in the document so those weaknesses could be addressed before the document was ever needed. He said that firm had been skilled and diligent and that their work had made the document stronger at 12 specific points. He used the word thorough again. Eleanor said she was beginning to understand, finally and completely, exactly what William had meant when he used it in the sunroom that January afternoon. Carter found out on a Monday. Not from Eleanor and not from Whitfield directly but from Douglas Fenn, who received a formal legal notice from Whitfield and Associates on the Friday morning of Eleanor's meeting, notifying him that a primary estate document existed that superseded any other documents that might be presented regarding the Hargrove estate and that all matters relating to its administration should be directed to Whitfield and Associates going forward. Douglas Fenn read the notice 3 times. Then he called Carter. Carter later told Diane it was one of the worst phone calls he had ever received, which was a significant statement from a man who had received the call about his father's death 8 days earlier. But grief, even genuine grief, is a different category of blow than the specific blow of being told that something you have organized the expectations of your life around for 30 years was never going to be yours. Grief is about loss. This was about the discovery that what you believed you had was never real. Carter retained a legal team within 48 hours. It was a large, aggressive firm with significant experience in high-stakes estate disputes, and they moved with a speed and a comprehensiveness that reflected both their skill and the urgency their client communicated to them. Within 2 weeks they had filed a formal challenge to the primary estate document on several grounds. The first was undue influence, arguing that Eleanor had exerted inappropriate control over William's estate planning in the final years of his life. The second was mental capacity, arguing that William's health in his final years had compromised his judgment in ways that invalidated the document. The third was procedural, challenging specific elements of how the document had been constructed and executed. Carter gave 2 interviews to financial publications during this period in which he spoke with careful precision about his concerns regarding his father's estate planning process, using language that was legally defensible while simultaneously being publicly damaging to Eleanor's reputation in ways that were clearly intentional. Diane's attorney released a statement expressing the family's distress and their commitment to pursuing all available remedies. Renee made statements to people she should not have made statements to, and some of those statements found their way to places she had not intended, creating problems that required their own separate management. The legal challenge lasted 14 months. It was expensive and thorough, and it generated significant attention in financial and legal circles because a $62 billion estate dispute involving the complete exclusion of adult children from a first marriage is not a common event, and the specific circumstances of this one made it the kind of case that people who follow such matters discussed at considerable length. Carter's legal team worked with genuine skill. They were not going through motions. They believed, or argued with sufficient conviction to suggest belief, that there were real vulnerabilities in the document that could be successfully exploited. They were wrong at every point they tested. The undue influence argument was met with documentation showing that Eleanor had not been present at any planning session with Whitfield and Associates, that William had conducted every meeting independently, and that the structure of the planning process had been specifically designed by William himself to ensure that Eleanor's involvement was limited to being named as beneficiary rather than participating in the construction of the document. The mental capacity argument was met with 3 years of medical records, board meeting minutes, and sworn testimony from members of William's executive team about his clarity and precision in the months immediately before his death. William had chaired a board meeting 11 days before he was hospitalized. The minutes of that meeting ran to 40 pages, and his CFO testified that the analysis William produced in that meeting was among the sharpest he had seen in 20 years of working alongside him. The procedural arguments were addressed one by one with the kind of meticulous documented precision that made it clear to every party that these responses had not been assembled reactively but had been prepared in anticipation of exactly these arguments being made. William had thought of everything. He had thought of it because he had spent 30 years watching his children and had arrived at a clear and unsentimental understanding of exactly what they would do when the moment came. And he had made sure that what they would do would not work. The challenge was dismissed on every count. Every argument. Every procedural objection. Every ground on which Carter's team had built their case. The estate passed to Eleanor Hargrove in full accordance with the terms of the primary document that had been sitting in a private vault in Manhattan for 3 years waiting for exactly this moment. $58 billion in assets transferred to a woman who had been standing on a stone step in the November cold 14 months earlier with a photograph under her arm and nowhere to go and nothing to hold on to except whatever was left of her dignity. The legal fees on Carter's side of the dispute ran to tens of millions of dollars. The outcome did not change by a single dollar. What happened to Carter, Diane, and Renee in the months and years following the dismissal is worth understanding because it illustrates something true about what happens to people when the story they have been telling themselves about their lives turns out to have been wrong from the beginning. Carter went quiet. Not immediately but gradually, over the weeks and months following the dismissal, as the reality of what had happened settled into the structure of his daily life in ways that could not be argued away or legally challenged or managed through a carefully worded statement to a financial publication. He was not destitute. He had built his own career and had his own assets and was by every reasonable external measure a successful man independent of anything connected to his father's estate. But he had organized a portion of his identity around the expectation of the Hargrove inheritance that was deeper than money, connected to something about who he believed himself to be and where he believed he stood in the order of things, and the absence of what he had always expected left a gap in that self-understanding that was not something his own assets could fill because it was not really about the assets. Diane redirected her energy into her professional life with an intensity that people around her found slightly alarming, as if forward movement itself could outrun the weight of what had happened. Renee had the hardest time of the three, partly because she had been the most openly hostile to Eleanor across 31 years and therefore had the most to face about herself in the aftermath, and partly because the things she had said to people she should not have said them to had created a record that existed independently of her ability to revise or retract it. Eleanor did not speak publicly about any of it. She gave no interviews. She made no statements. She did not respond to the things Carter had said in the financial publications. She hired a small and excellent team of advisors and she began the work of understanding and managing what William had left her with the same careful and unhurried attention she had always brought to things that genuinely mattered. It was, by any objective measure, an overwhelming amount to absorb. $62 billion is not an abstraction when it becomes your specific and daily responsibility. It is specific assets and specific obligations and specific decisions that require specific knowledge applied consistently and correctly over time. Eleanor approached it the way she had always approached a piece of land that needed work, which was to look at it carefully, understand what was actually there before deciding what should change, and make decisions that were rooted in the real nature of the thing rather than in what she wished it were or what other people expected her to do with it. She established a foundation in William's name within the first year of the estate settling. Its focus was land conservation and workforce development, reflecting both her own professional background and the priorities William had expressed in the final years of his life. She made investment decisions that people in William's former professional circles watched with the particular attention reserved for someone who was not supposed to be in the room at all and turned out to understand the room with a precision and a depth that was difficult to explain away. She was not trying to prove anything to anyone. That was the thing that the people watching her most closely eventually came to understand about her. She was simply doing what she had always done, which was paying careful attention, making considered decisions, and trusting that the work itself was the point rather than the observation of it. The Hargrove estate in Greenwich where Carter had closed the door on her 8 hours after his father died was among the assets that transferred to Eleanor in the settlement. She donated it to a land conservation trust within 6 months of the estate settling. She did not need it as a symbol. She did not need it as a statement or as a demonstration of anything to anyone. She looked at it as a piece of land and asked what the best use of that land was, and then she made that happen. It was the kind of decision that told you more about her character than anything a lawyer or a journalist could have written, because it was made without an audience and without any expectation that it would be noticed or credited or used as evidence of anything about her. She simply decided what was right and did it. There is a detail from the 3 years of William's secret estate planning that James Whitfield eventually shared in a professional context, without identifying his client but in terms precise enough that people who knew the case understood who he meant. He said that William had told him, in one of their early meetings, that he was not leaving his wife money. He was leaving her the ability to do whatever she decided was worth doing with however much time she had remaining. Whitfield said that in 28 years of estate law he had never heard a client describe an inheritance in those terms. He said he thought about it regularly in the years after the case resolved. He said it was the most honest and accurate description of what an estate actually is and what it actually does when it is built by the right person for the right reason that he had ever encountered in his professional life. He said he wrote it down in a personal notebook the evening after William said it and that the notebook was still on his desk. On the day the legal challenge was finally dismissed and the estate settled in full, Eleanor was not in a courtroom or a conference room or a lawyer's office. She was in a garden in Vermont, a property she had purchased 8 months earlier with her own resources, standing in early morning light with her hands in the pockets of a barn coat, looking at a piece of land that needed work and thinking about what she wanted to plant in the spring. Her phone rang. It was James Whitfield. He told her it was done. The dismissal was final. The settlement was complete. She thanked him. She put the phone back in her pocket. She stood in that garden for another few minutes looking at the land, the way the early light was coming through the trees at that particular angle that happens before the sun is fully up, the way the ground looked like it was holding something just below the surface that the spring would eventually bring forward. And then she picked up the tools she had set down when the phone rang. And she got back to work. William Hargrove spent 3 years building something that nobody around him knew he was building. He built it with the same obsessive thoroughness that had built his empire and his reputation and everything else he had ever made that was worth making. He built it for one person. And he built it because he understood something that the people who had spent 31 years waiting for a different outcome had never been able to grasp, which was that the things genuinely worth building are not built out of obligation or blood or the assumption that proximity to something makes it yours by right. They are built out of trust. The kind of trust that takes a long time to earn and a lifetime to deserve. Eleanor Hargrove had earned it over 31 years of showing William exactly who she was. And William, who had built $60 billion on the principle that most people cannot be trusted and had been proven right about that more times than he could count, had known from the morning she turned away from him to finish her conversation about drainage grades that she was the exception to everything he had learned about people. He had known it. And he had spent the last 3 years of his life making absolutely certain that what he knew about her would outlast everything that anyone else believed. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We read every single comment. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about patience and trust and what it really means to know someone completely, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that subscribe button because the next story is already coming and it is going to reach something in you that this one did not quite get to. The stories we tell on this channel are not finished. Stay close.